Chris Canario, welcome to my podcast.
Thanks, Will. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so we'll just dive right in. My podcast is focused on specifically, talking with Harvard students and alums about their experience both before, during, and after, and ultimately, a lot of society has viewed Harvard as this great institution. It's brought a lot of smart, bright people through its doors, and I think a lot of people would be interested in kind of learning about the people behind, these institutions and kind of learning a little bit more about interesting people like you. And so let's dive right in.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
So why did you apply to Harvard Business School?
Loaded question. Overall, I was sitting actually at home during COVID as I was graduating undergrad with an engineering degree, trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do with my life. That graduation point, I think, is a big culmination of, okay, you've worked so hard to get your undergrad degree, where are you going to go afterward? And I'd gone through a couple engineering opportunities and internships during undergrad and realized that I didn't want to strictly stay as an engineer for the rest of my life. I really enjoy engineering, it's a huge passion of mine, but I think there's a lot of big time decisions and directions engineering companies take that are not actually solely based on engineers. They're heavily based on upper managers and investments and funding, especially in the space background that I came from. And so I knew I wanted to push more into the actual management side of engineering firms. Then I looked at, okay, how do I actually get to that point in my career? And business school, in my mind, made a lot of sense for that. To take my engineering degree and engineering experience, go get a business school degree, and then work my way up into more of a upper management level within an engineering firm. Harvard, obviously, is one of the first things that comes to mind when people even think about education, right? And so it was easily one of the first places I went to look for high quality business education. And I didn't know a ton about business either, or business schools, MBA programs. So there was a ton of early research into what do I want out of an MBA program? What am I looking for? And I obviously wanted a high quality education experience. So Harvard ended up at the top of my list. And because I was coming out of undergrad, I really was interested in jumping into engineering management and getting my MBA as soon as possible. But then I realized a lot of the actually high quality MBA programs really require that you work before going into your MBA. So that time during COVID, when I was graduating, I couldn't actually apply and just get straight into an MBA program and start then. But I realized a lot of upper level programs have deferred enrollment programs, which was extremely of interest to me. So I would apply right as I was graduating undergrad, get into an MBA program, but then they would say, okay, now come back in a couple of years after you had more full-time experience. And I thought that was a good way to set myself up to get into a real business degree with more built-up engineering experience. Harvard has an excellent 2+2 program, which is their deferred enrollment program, along with a few other big-time schools that I applied to at that time, which I thought was a great opportunity to just get in the pipeline early and just get that base foundation in admissions to these MBA programs.
Absolutely. And you're here.
I am.
Yeah, now that you're here, I think for a student, the perspective is still fresh. Tell us about your experience here at Harvard Business School so far. What has been kind of like, drastically different from expectations that you might have thought before you were entering into this institution, and what has been really the biggest change for you since you came onto campus?
Yeah, I think especially as people look at MBA programs, there is this stigma around what an MBA program is, especially in the current environment, heavy on it's a networking experience. You're showing up not necessarily because it's going to be a rigorous education experience compared to like an engineering undergrad where you're heavily focused on going to class, doing all your work and figuring out what engineering is. My understanding of MBA programs was it's way more of a networking opportunity. You get put in a classroom with a bunch of very interesting people from a bunch of cool backgrounds, and you get to spend the time interacting with them. You go on wild trips, right? You're doing as much social things as possible, and maybe education falls on the wayside. Big difference when I actually came to HBS was, oh, there actually is a lot of work to do. HBS has really pushed on us how much the education side of the MBA program is extremely important, whereas other programs have not pushed that same rigor. HBS has made a conscious effort to make sure that people are showing up for the educational experience. And for me, coming from an engineering background, I've actually found it extremely helpful because I don't have an understanding of finance or marketing or any of the things that some other people coming from different backgrounds already have those foundations. For me, having that academic rigor is extremely important. It's just a lot more than I think most of us expected. And so now it's like, oh, wait, do I want to spend all this time going to social events and making the most out of the networking opportunities relative to I actually need to hit the books every now and then and actually study up on what I need to do.
Yeah, and one of the biggest things that Harvard is known for is, of course, the case methodology, where every single class, in general, we read a case based on something that happens in real life to a business, to an organization, or to even a person. And you do 2 to 3 of those a day during your first year. How has the case methodology been for you?
I absolutely love the case method. I think it is easily the best way to learn a new topic. And I also think it's just the best way, like any of us learn. We always learn from our experiences historically. We look back and say, oh, what could we have done? Whereas it is different than traditional undergrad engineering, where it's like, hey, here's an equation, go plug this equation in with these numbers, figure out how it works.
Yeah.
The case method is really focused on, can you take an ambiguous situation, apply certain frameworks or certain concepts to it, and formulate your own opinions, especially based on like the cases don't always have right answers. So everyone across our section, our classmates, will come to different conclusions based on their past experience, based on the frameworks that they're using, on what actually should happen in the case. What is the ultimate takeaway? And because of that, we get so many different opinions. I think you learn a lot faster doing that, of taking in, hey, this person came to this conclusion for X, Y, Z reason. That you can reflect on yourself and be like, oh, I didn't consider that because I don't have that past experience. I was looking at it through this lens rather than this lens. And it opens up a much better perspective on tackling business issues that I think is really unrivaled.
Absolutely. And, Harvard Business School is one of the biggest business school programs in the country in terms of scale, where it's generally 900 to 1,000 people. But it is split into smaller groupings known as sections, and where you're, about 90 to 95 people are in each section. How do you feel the sectioner experience has been for the learning experience and just for your general experience as a student?
Yeah, I think it's extremely helpful. There are goods and bads in my mind of it. The very high positives is in that case study method of your first year, you're going to hang out with the same section in class every day. You have the same 90 to 95 students that you're always interacting with and always going through the same cases together.
Yeah.
So you start to really understand where people are coming from, what kind of comments they're going to have, because you start to understand exactly where everyone's past experiences line up and how they evaluate cases. And it creates a much more tight-knit community going into cases, where especially when there's more sensitive topics that if you just have a bunch of people that you're not really as familiar with, it might be harder to discuss those more openly. And so the section experience really helps to build that community early on, mutually understanding each other's experiences and being able to have hard conversations in class. That is extremely important for the case method.
Yeah, fantastic. Now let's dive a little bit into your background, right? You're a successful candidate for Harvard Business School. You've gotten in, but you mentioned you applied during college, at the end of college for your program. But can you share with us a little bit about your background? Growing up, like what led you to become the Chris we see today, right? I believe you've had experience living in both California and Texas.
That's true. I think a lot adds up to who I am now. It's probably too long of a detailed story to tell right now. But general overview, yeah, I was born and raised in California in the San Francisco Bay Area. My dad was a diehard Texas A&M Aggie, so he went to Texas A&M for undergrad, studied aerospace engineering. And so I was born and raised in a very Texas A&M focused household, even as we were on the West Coast, surrounded by more Stanford and Berkeley and Cal fans. I was always a diehard Texas A&M fan. So then when it came to leaving high school, looking at where I wanted to go for college, Texas A&M really stood out to me. But being in California around the tech mindset was also super interesting. I still have a bunch of friends out in California that stuck around that tech bubble, which I think really influenced both the culture within like the high school that I went to and beyond how I evaluate different opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've had this gap, right, between HBS, between college and graduation, and you took that time to work and get some experience before you have this longer aspirational goal that you want to achieve. Tell us a little bit about the job experiences that you've had. Specifically, I believe you worked at NASA at first, right?
Yeah. So when I went to undergrad at Texas A&M, I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And I think a lot of what drives people's careers is having some sort of vision or like a goal for what they want to achieve in their life. And at Texas A&M, I really feel like I found out what that was for me, which was the advancement of human spaceflight. I truly believe the future of humanity is in space. When we talk about the next frontier, space really is that, and the expansion of that will be similar to the expansion of humans across the world. And so we have a lot of really interesting economic and cultural opportunities as we expand into space. So when I was at Texas A&M and really realized that this is the thing that I wanted to pursue, I spent all my undergrad pursuing that, and then even after Texas A&M, jumping into NASA. So when I was at Texas A&M, I worked at the Aerospace Human Systems Lab under the Aerospace Engineering Department, where I was working directly with a former astronaut on current space experimentation projects. Then I did a couple internships at Sierra Space, doing systems engineering for their Dream Chaser spacecraft to really understand how the current commercial spaceflight industry is working. And then an internship at BAE Systems working on submarine systems for the Navy. Slightly different take, similar technologies and similar engineering practices, but I wanted to really understand how the defense side rather than the commercial side of engineering is really set up. Then after graduating Texas A&M, I ended up working at NASA, which sort of fell in my lap. That's a whole different story, but working as a Flight Controller Trainee for the International Space Station. So the International Space Station has been around for 20 years now and is operated 24/7, 365 by flight operators in Houston, Texas. So after graduating Texas A&M, I moved down to Houston to support that group as a trainee. Basically, I was set up to study the entire International Space Station back to front to understand exactly what are all the systems involved in keeping astronauts alive on the ISS, which is an extremely difficult, constant challenge because space does not like humans being in it generally. There's a lot of engineering systems that go into making sure humans stay alive. So I had to memorize all the systems down to every single valve, every single sensor, what exactly everything does on the ISS. And then if I had completed my training, which I didn't because I ended up leaving, I would have ended up sitting on console for the ISS, actively monitoring the systems and making sure the astronauts were safe and active in their responsibilities in terms of research and other activities that the ISS provides to the public.
Absolutely. How was the process of, in your time at NASA, what was the culture like? Because, NASA itself also has this, even sort of mythical, of course, reputation. It's, the foremost space agency in the world, among the best, and obviously has led the way for many human milestones in pushing us outwards into space, which I think, of course, is such a vital task that often is understated. And NASA's budget is only a tiny fraction of the overall budget, but it's been able to achieve so much in that short time frame already.
Yeah, I think the culture especially when you talk about government jobs now compared to commercial opportunities, NASA is heavily driven by those people that are passionate. Everyone at NASA is there because they believe in the NASA mission of expanding humans into space and expanding space opportunities for everybody. That comes with some downsides in terms of you could make way more money going and working for a other private company, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, something more on the defense side that do similar technologies, but under different like DoD contracts per se. The people that go to NASA could make way more money elsewhere, but they're at NASA because they are super inspired by the mission. Also, because it is a government-funded system, they also have to be somewhat risk averse, where we've seen in the past problems within NASA that cause tragedies in spaceflight. And so NASA has really taken those to heart in terms of making sure that everyone is extremely detail-oriented, everything is going through the proper paperwork, the proper processes, which comes at somewhat of a downside in terms of a slow environment compared to what you see in a lot of new tech, even new space commercial companies. So there is somewhat of a slow culture process, but it's put there for a reason. If you're operating the International Space Station, they want to make sure you are 110% ready to operate the International Space Station. They don't want someone that's like, hey, they understand most of it and they're good enough, let's throw them in there. They want to be 110% sure because they can't really risk anything going wrong. So the culture, in my mind, some of those people were the absolute smartest, most passionate people I've ever worked with. And it was extremely inspiring to be part of that system and that history especially.
Yeah.
You walk into NASA and you're like, I'm here. Like, this is the building that they like landed the moon on within like this control room. Just insane to like really think about the historical endeavors that have been done by NASA, and to be around that culture is truly inspiring going forward. But now NASA is definitely trying to slowly take a different approach to human spaceflight, and so they're in a slightly different position than they were 60 years ago.
Certainly, and we've seen the private sector take up some of that, and I believe you next step in your career journey in space, you went on to work for Axiom.
Yes.
Specifically, and that's a private sector organization. What kind of drew you to that organization versus kind of continuing on at NASA?
Yeah. So at NASA, definitely the jobs at NASA are meant to be career jobs. Is you get in the NASA system early and you are there for the next 30, 40 years of your career, and you retire as a government employee, you get pension and all that. I knew that just looking at the future of space flight, it's going to be more commercial in the future, and I want to be part of that new space endeavor. Axiom Space is one of those companies that's really trying to push the boundaries of commercial space flights. So for those that don't know, the International Space Station is set to be decommissioned in the 2030 time period. With that, we will lose a lot of capabilities in space in terms of like constant human space flight, ability to have experiments in space. Axiom Space is this private company that's looking to fix that by launching their own commercial space station before the International Space Station is actually decommissioned. That way, when the ISS is decommissioned, we still have some of those capabilities now on a commercial space program instead of a government program. NASA really likes that because they don't have to pay for a space station anymore. It'll all be commercially owned and operated. And so I thought that was an extremely important mission that Axiom has. And it was a great opportunity for me to really expand into more of a commercial engineering role, to really jump from more of an operation role in NASA to strict new design. We're like trying to reinvent everything that we know about human spaceflight. I thought that mission was extremely promising, and that's something I wanted to do.
So building a brand new habitation, infrastructure in space is certainly a challenge since we don't have much out there. What was, to the extent that you can share, what would be kind of like a day-to-day experience for you when you were at Axiom, kind of tackling this very vital mission?
Yeah, so I served two roles at Axiom. Originally, I was a systems engineer, so really looking at more of the technical, high-level requirement sets of how do we keep a human alive in space? What are the actual technical measures that we need to meet to be able to make sure our astronauts are safe and healthy and can do what they need to do, whether that be like the current research operations that the ISS does, or expanding that into more commercial sectors like tourism opportunities and other areas like that, that Axiom is really trying to push towards. So for systems engineering day to day, it was evaluating different requirement sets, talking to our engineers about, hey, on the ground floor, what are our current components capable of doing? How are we developing those in-house? And how are we pushing those forward to meet the different requirement sets that we're building? And how are we putting the whole thing together? How are we integrating all these different components to make a big space station that can handle all these different requirement sets?
Absolutely. And what was the second role that you took on at Axiom?
So the second role, I switched into more of a project management position, specifically for our life control group. So I was then evaluating more, what are our timelines, what are our budgets, how are we actually trying to meet the requirement goals, but more from a business perspective. How are we trying to meet those budgets and schedules while also keeping in mind all this technical work that we have to do?
Sounds like you're already kind of taking on some of that management experience that, certainly you hope to gain at HBS as well.
That was definitely the goal of that transition. Was I knew that I was definitely going to end up pushing more towards that management perspective, and Axiom gave me a great opportunity to sort of start that off very early in my career before jumping over to HBS, because I knew I was in that deferred enrollment program. I knew I was going to have to make that leap from Axiom to go to HBS and get my MBA. I really want to have more of a business understanding experience going into HBS.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, let's dive back into a little bit about, HBS and what you hope to take from it and beyond, ultimately, right? We're here for 2 years. The HBS experience certainly is a unique one. Where do you see yourself kind of post HBS? Kind of what is the next step in this challenge that you aim to really go put your life towards?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of open opportunities out there. My main goal overall is to try to figure out how we actually make space profitable from a business perspective. A lot of previous space programs have been heavy investments for R&D that don't always really work out in terms of commercial viability, especially when you try to not look at the government funding coming in. If you look purely at the commercial side, very rough to make profitable businesses. So really, I want to look into that and try to figure out how we actually can make successful investments in the future. With that, I'm really looking at investment opportunities, so more of getting into a VC venture capital firm that specializes in space investments. That's a brand new area. There are very few venture capital firms that are specializing in space, but because how commercial space has grown in the past decade, 2 decades, more and more of these firms are popping up that are looking at, hey, there's a bunch of money going into human space flight, commercial space flight programs. We want to get a piece of that pie. And it's then trying to figure out, okay, which of these commercial companies is actually a viable concept, rather than just some cool rocket stuff that looks cool on paper, but might not actually turn into a profitable business.
What do you feel, it's so interesting, right? Like there is that, government is investing tens of billions into it, and globally hundreds of billions in resources towards kind of this effort. And you see finally in the 21st century, actually private companies pursuing, for-profit ventures in space, now that the road has been laid in some ways already by the public, by taxpayers, in the US and globally. But what do you see, where are the kind of in the next 2-3 decades, the profitable areas potentially that can become profitable to sustain private enterprise?
Yeah, and it's that's the question that everyone's asking right now, especially when we try to evaluate these new space companies of, do any of these really make sense? And so in the short term, the main money makers on the commercial side are Earth observation companies and telecommunications companies. So Starlink right now, Wi-Fi access, all these small satellite concepts that provide direct support on Earth. So Starlink's a good example of that in terms of giving Wi-Fi access to the entire Earth, theoretically. And there's other companies trying to do that, very similar concepts. Earth observation side, it's the thought that by having more and more data on what is going on Earth, we can use that data, especially with advancements in AI systems and data analytics, to then make better decisions on Earth. We look at farming opportunities based on different weather patterns, or insurance companies having better data to make proper premium charges on. There's a lot of work right now going into those kind of companies. Further term, we look at space tourism stuff, which actually is pretty underway right now in Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic. SpaceX has done some stuff as well of will people pay to go to space, which I think is yet to fully be seen. There's definitely opportunities right now, but how far will that go and how cheap can we actually make it for the common person to take a weekend to space or whatever the future vacation in space really looks like. And then even further term, we're looking at how can we actually turn space into a manufacturing factory? So is there opportunities in space where we can manufacture materials or biotech-based materials under zero gravity? When you have zero gravity, compared to 1 gravity on Earth, where you have to build all these support structures around materials when you're like 3D printing or doing certain manufacturing processes. In space under zero gravity, you have way less restrictions, and theoretically, you can make materials even stronger in space that then you could ship back down to Earth and sell for a profit.
Interesting. And part of what makes space ventures so expensive is because you have to bring them up into space, and the fuel necessary behind it costs a lot of money to get stuff up into space. Do you think that space, producing things in space in the next few decades is feasible to, gather resources from asteroids or other kind of celestial bodies, kind of secure the resources to have enough resources to produce what becomes essentially a self-sustaining kind of a space factory?
Yeah, I think we're pretty far away from utilizing asteroids or in-space mining as really viable, to make cut costs and make profit margins. I think right now material is really, really cheap on Earth relative to what it is in space. It's basically the amount of resources that you have to invest to just get anything from space, like mining an asteroid, are unfathomable compared to how much it is to find the nearest mine that can pull it out of the Earth for relatively cheap compared to what it is in space. In the future, that's definitely, I think, what people will look for in terms of mining asteroids, mining on the moon, in terms of accessing resources much faster. But right now, in the next 20, 30 years, I think we'll be heavily reliant on Earth-based materials to really test out what space is in the next 20, 30 years. We really can't even prove that there are really profitable materials that you can make in space and ship back down and make profit on it. That is still yet to be seen. So right now, we're going to be more using Earth materials as a test bed, launching them, seeing how they work out, and then hopefully making a profit as we send them back.
And you talk about resources being cheap here on Earth to use, but now in society we're facing often there's a debate. There are people who feel that a common argument is asking, why do we need to invest in space when we have so much issues or tackling issues of climate change and resource scarcity here on Earth? Why invest tens of billions, even more in the future, into space? What do you view as kind of for those that don't necessarily believe in kind of investing resources into space development, human colonization? Why should people care about this investment ultimately?
Yeah, and I think obviously there are so many problems at the same time that we're all trying to focus on, especially at HBS. I think it's more prevalent than ever. The people at HBS are really focused on handling problems across the world. There are people doing clean technologies and want to solve world hunger and figure out how we can really tackle all these big societal problems. I think space is a huge, huge key tool in doing a lot of those. The amount of technologies that we've gotten from spaceflight are actually insane to think about it. And even the day-to-day, how much we interact with space technology that people don't even realize is incredibly inspiring. So everyone's using GPS all the time. If anyone's ever pulled out their phone and used any location-based software from GPS, the global positioning system, that's all run by the Air Force. That's a big satellite constellation in space. Now, when we look at like Earth observation stuff and other Wi-Fi networks and telecommunications, those all have ability to come back to Earth and support real problems on Earth. When we talk about like hunger and trying to increase how much food we can actually produce on Earth, Earth imaging from satellites in orbit could be an extremely useful tool to improve our efficiencies on Earth and support continual growth of food. And there's plenty of other experiences with that within spaceflight where our technology directly then comes back to Earth and is meant to fully support the problems here on Earth. Going forward, I think we have even more opportunities as we expand into other industries within space. When we talk about manufacturing, one of the key concepts in manufacturing in space is pharmaceuticals. What diseases on Earth have we really not found out how to fix, but we might find even more cures when we go to space? We talk about printing human organs in order to save lives here on Earth. That might be something that actually is capable of being done in space and can directly come back and support life here on Earth.
Why can't that be done here on Earth versus like why is that more promising, the organ part in space versus Earth?
Yeah, and that's where I don't know a ton about the printing of biochemical material, but from my understanding, it's making and controlling growth of organic material on Earth is extremely difficult. Like I was talking about with gravity, it's very hard to grow material properly with all the support structures you need. Mm-hmm. And there's the concept that maybe when you put it under zero gravity, you actually can develop much finer material, like biochemical material or pharmaceuticals, in a much higher quantity and quality, and then send that back to Earth and make it, hopefully, if we can get costs right, actually profitable and also cheap for those on Earth. So it's not just a premium product, but that's actually something that could support all of humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's dive a little bit into, a little bit more far out, space as a concept. You talk about, we have this destiny that we believe humans should go into space. And often our science fiction literature, movies, and media, space is a popular setting, but one that often portrays space as a great mystery, but also one that is potentially fraught with dangers of, facing, life that ultimately isn't human. Do you personally think that there is life out there besides that isn't human?
Yes, I do.
All right. Well, that's the easy question. But there are many literatures that, what should humans do when we do eventually make that initial contact?
Yeah.
What is, in your opinion, the approach humanity should take to navigate towards that eventual step? Maybe it won't be for the next 10, 20 years. Maybe it might be at the end of the century, depending on how far we achieve it. But, the assumption, correct me if I'm wrong, is that we'll eventually find other life out there in the galaxy.
Yeah. And I think what happens when it happens, I'm a huge fan of the concept of finding aliens out there. I think it's super interesting and really will teach us a lot about our place in the universe, what the universe really looks like, and how life really works other than on Earth. The question really is, what is that going to look like when we find it? We could end up on Mars and finding microbials in different soils, right? We could find microorganisms anywhere in the solar system. We probably will not find an intelligent civilization on Mars, probably. We probably will not find an intelligent civilization like humans anywhere close to Earth right now, but eventually maybe. I think more likely we're going into microbes or microorganisms, and more than likely just have to grapple with that, understanding that if these are here, there are probably bigger things out there that could be advanced civilizations that eventually we might have contact with. And I think that will be wildly inspiring and also terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we find fish in the ocean near where we swim, but if we go deep enough, we'll find the bigger beasts out there for sure.
There's a big squid out there.
There's a big squid out there, and there's one in space perhaps one day. But yeah, we'll bring it a little bit back towards life in space.
Sure.
So, have you seen the TV show The Expanse?
I have, yes. Big fan of The Expanse.
Big fan of that.
I
love The Expanse.
Highly recommend.
Highly recommend. Maybe they'll keep making them based on the books. We'll see. We'll see. But that's the setting of, I believe, a few centuries in the future. But it all starts, and I think the next step, as the great techno king, his goals, Elon Musk, is to have humans colonize Mars, the moon, then Mars, perhaps, and set up viable colonies. Do you see that as something that might be feasible in the next half century?
I think we'll see it in the next half century. I think it would be surprising if we don't have some sort of effort in that realm within the next 50 years. How long-term is that? How sustainable is that? I think is yet to be seen. I think we're way more likely to adjust our plans as we can actually get out to Mars. When we get those first couple human spaceflight missions out to Mars, we're going to learn a lot about what Mars has to offer, and if it actually does make sense for us to send more long-term colonies out there. But I do think it's incredibly inspiring concept. That's actually what I wrote about in my essay to get into HBS, was the process of expanding and colonizing other planets, and really more about the cultural implications that really has for humanity. When we talk about the expansion of human into other planets, we have opportunities really to evaluate what our life is here on Earth. And like all the problems that we talked about earlier, there are a lot of problems on this world. And if we got to blank slate it a little bit and say, okay, we want to restart, we're going to settle down on a new planet, we get to make our own systems the way that we want to, whether it be government or community or financial systems that better support the next age of what humanity looks like in space. I think that's really where we're going to see an extremely exciting time when we talk about long-term missions on Mars.
Mars itself, we haven't even gotten there yet. We haven't sent the first human there yet. But I believe we do currently have astronauts, as we speak, being prepared to go back to the moon from the United States. Was the Artemis program.
Yep.
Why do you think it just took so long for us to return back to the moon, firstly, and then, what is the time scale you see? And do you think it'll be the public, NASA, or do you think it'll be more for a private venture that will get humanity first to Mars?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think the best way to evaluate why it took so long to get back to the moon is really by evaluating why we went in the first place, which it's no secret that our original Apollo missions that went to the moon back in the 60s, 70s were heavily based around political goals between the US and the Soviet Union at the time. The US really wanted to prove their capability in terms of technology development, mainly around missile developments. Early rockets were really they just took the nuke off the top of a rocket and then put a human instead, which is a wild concept that for some reason some Air Force pilots back in the day were like, yeah, I'll sit on top of that. But that's really what got us in the first place. It was a massive push by the US government to prove out our capability as a country to go to the moon. There was very little financial incentive to it. We basically got no money out of it. It was purely to show off what we were capable of as a country. And as soon as that government funding went away, we got to the moon, we proved that we're better than the Russians. We said, okay, there's no reason to go back. Let's stop funding these programs. And there really was no one else to really take that place back. There was no commercial entity at that time that was saying, hey, this was such a cheap program, we got so much money off it, let's keep this going, let's fund it from a commercial perspective. That just never happened. And so I think the reason we didn't see anyone go back was it really wasn't financially viable, and the government really didn't have a motive to go do that. Since then, we saw so many different changes within spaceflight from the government program's perspective. We saw Space Shuttle come in to really establish more long-term human missions in space, more constant human missions in space for experimentation purposes, and then the creation of the ISS, which really put a foothold around NASA's focus being around the Earth in low Earth orbit, less than human spaceflight going out to the moon or Mars. We have seen more programs push for Mars recently, but because the political dichotomy of one party wants this thing, then we switch some things up, and another party wants these things, we really haven't gotten a long-term program from NASA to go on these long moon missions or Mars missions in a very long time. Now, I think there is more political pressure as other countries have stepped up their spacefaring game. China especially has put a lot of pressure on the US to make sure that we remain a leader in human spaceflight, especially, which I think is a big push of why Artemis is happening now. On the other side is the commercial aspects. There are way more commercial companies now that are finding out that launching vehicles and having stuff in space can be profitable. So there's more financial funding, I think, and investments to go back to the moon. Because now these investors have seen launch vehicles made money, these small sites are making money. Maybe there is some money to be made at the moon if we can go back and properly use it and have all these new, more efficient financial systems around getting us there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard for many people to imagine. We've seen the videos of Blue Origin, especially, where they sent people up briefly into space. I believe Shatner went up, and many have called it a life-changing experience. Would you personally, if given the opportunity, once it becomes much more achievable for civilians, for ordinary folks, or folks to go up into space, would you take that step?
100%.
How far would you be willing to go? Would you go to like ISS level? Would you be willing to go to the moon if that was an opportunity made available?
Yeah, I think if I had the opportunity, I would be one of the first people going to Mars. I really think that would be super interesting. Some might say it's a one-way trip, but I think the advancement of the human species into space is extremely important and something that I would be willing to sacrifice a lot for. So I would love to do that. On the other side is the actual capability side of it and how accessible space is. I actually was just talking with a girl yesterday who was working on representation within space and how we're actually handling expansion of accessibility to different groups of people, especially disabilities. And space is hard. It's really hard to keep a human alive in space. And NASA, from the get-go, was saying we want the cream of the crop, athleticism, the best health you can possibly be to go to space.
Right.
And over time, we've slowly expanded that to allow more people from different backgrounds and different health ratings. And then Blue Origin and other commercial spaceflight groups are now trying to expand that even more into more able-bodied people. But we still have a large expanse of people that right now just don't have the capability of going to space because we don't have that same representation, the same accessibility to people of extreme backgrounds or disabilities. And that will take a lot of time to get to. The engineering is very technical, it's very detailed, and so the expansion of accessibility in space takes a lot of effort to get to that level. Around low Earth orbit, I think we have more opportunities, but as we talk about those more adventurous missions, we talk about going back to the moon or going to Mars, those will probably be a lot more technically specific, where we'll probably keep very strict health concerns because we really don't want those becoming a problem on such a risky mission.
That makes sense. And what are the factors that might determine if a candidate is space worthy or not? You mentioned, is to be the cream of the crop, that, you have to be in peak physical condition. What would a person need to be in general, do you think, now, and perhaps it might be easier in the future, in order to become viable to go to space? Is there any immediate no's for a person right now that would disqualify them for health or other reasons from going into space?
Yeah, historically, there were some major things that they tried to avoid, which was actually very similar to how some of the military screenings work, of passing certain physical tests in terms of how far can you run, how much can you take certain gravity loadings. So like the acceleration test is really cool, and where they just spin you around a circle as fast as possible in a fancy machine and see how much force you could take before passing out. And was especially a worry back in the day because basically all astronaut had to do was just survive the flight up. Now you're doing a lot more in space, and our rockets are theoretically more calm and easier to go up. So we'll still have some concerns in terms of, can you actually handle the G-loading of launch? Can you handle landing physically? Then when we look at more long-term human spaceflight presence on the ISS, especially, we've looked at like what long-term health concerns could pop up that we couldn't really respond to in space. I actually have a food allergy, a pretty severe peanut allergy, which has been a severe concern for astronauts for a while, because if you do have some sort of severe reaction in space, there's not a nearby hospital that you can take an ambulance down to if something goes wrong. And similar for a lot of conditions like that, where they're just worried about something popping up that they couldn't immediately respond to. So when we talk about expanding that, it's expanding medical care in space and what can we actually have in space. So if something does go wrong, we can immediately respond to it. We don't have to worry about severe complications in the medical world in space.
Got it. And, one of the biggest things, is radiation, I believe, in space. The longer you're up there, the more exposed you are to cancers, to get cancer, and the further person away from the Earth is, the more exposed they are. So, what are ways potentially that we might be able to counteract that? Or, if I believe there's some studies that have said, you're on Mars, you'll probably not live longer than 3 to 5 years before you inevitably get cancer from the solar radiations hitting the Martian surface. That sounds all very grim. Is there some technology feasibilities for replicating kind of that radiation shielding? Do you think now, or is that a technology that needs to be developed?
Yeah, I think there's some very basic radiation shielding. We can put up 4 feet of concrete between you and the radiation. The only thing is it's very hard to launch 4 feet thick concrete walls into a launch vehicle. So it's really a matter of how cheap can we launch radiation shielding, and then how much can we tolerate? How much radiation theoretically could you be exposed to, or what are the risks in play there? When we talk about like commercial space travel around the Earth especially, I think we're way more focused on, let's just expand our radiation shielding, let's make sure people are protected. But when we talk about going to Mars, you're way more technically limited, right? If you want to get a vehicle all the way to Mars, you're much more worried about what are your mass limitations, what are your power limitations, and super, super thick radiation shielding might not be super feasible for the mission that we're trying to pursue. That being said, when you get down onto the surface of Mars, there are certain things that we can do, such as using Martian terrain as your radiation shielding and trying to figure out how you prevent extreme radiation exposure when you're on the surface of Mars. But you still will be exposed to a large amount of radiation on the way to Mars. Oddly enough, one of the things that I think NASA and other groups are looking at for those missions is actually having older astronauts, because younger astronauts, if they are exposed to heavier doses of radiation, are more likely to actually get cancer over the course of their entire lives, versus older astronauts taking on that radiation has less of a chance to actually give them cancer in the long term, which has its gives and takes. So
you're saying that maybe not now, but when I'm 50 or 60, I have a chance.
You have a
to be an
chance.
astronaut.
You definitely have a chance, Will. I could see you on Mars someday.
Absolutely. We'll see. Let's see how expensive that is.
Yeah.
But no, well, I think we've learned a lot today about both your experience and why you're here at Harvard, as well as kind of your aspirations beyond. Thank you very much for joining me on this podcast, Chris.
Thanks so much, Will. It was a great time. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.